It's instructive to compare Jalisco Canta en Sevilla to another 1948 movie, Pito Perez se va de bracero, in which the Mexican protagonist travels to the United States. Whereas Nacho and Nopal merely purchased tickets to sail to Spain, Pito, turned down for the legal bracero program, has to cross illegally into the United States. Nacho and Nopal, out of money, are hired to work on Don Manolo's farm. Nacho, in particular, is given a position of trust and responsibility. Pito, on the other hand, can't work legally in the USA, and he has to take a succession of demeaning and underpaid jobs. At the end of Jalisco Canta en Sevilla, Nacho will return to Mexico with a fortune and his beautiful Spanish fiancée, while Pito Perez is deceived by a blonde gringa in league with gangsters and is deported to Mexico alone and penniless. This dichotomy can be viewed in terms of a risk-reward equation, and may be seen in many other films about Spaniards in Mexico, Mexicans in Spain, and Mexicans in the United States. For example, even a fairly innocuous movie like El Bracero del Año, 1964, concludes with a penniless Mexican hero returning to his homeland. More typical of later films is Deportados, 1975, in which the Mexican protagonist is killed by the border police, or Dos Hermanos Murieron, 1978, where the Ku Klux Klan murders two brothers. Over the next several decades, after Jalisco Canta en Sevilla, a significant number of films about Mexican-Spanish relations appeared, most about Spaniards in Mexico. There were some exceptions, of course, such as Dos Charros y una Gitana, 1956, and that's the Spanish Dos Novias para un Torero, Spanish title of the same film, and Échame a mí la culpa, 1958, both strongly reminiscent of Jalisco Canta en Sevilla, in other words, about charros who travel to Spain and fall in love. However, the majority of the 1950s movies in this category were Mexican-produced vehicles for visiting Spanish actresses like Sarita Montiel, Carmen Sevilla, Lola Flores, Paquita Rico, and Nini Marshall. Although she was Argentine, she played a Spanish character on the screen. One of the more interesting films is Gitana, Tenias, Casada, 1953. Although it was in fact a co-production between Filmex and Spain's Suevia Films, Gitana, Tenias, Casada features highly stereotyped images of Spaniards. Spanish actress Pastora, Carmen Sevilla, is flown to Mexico to appear in a movie with Pablo, played by Pedro Infante, an unknown mariachi being groomed as a star. Pastora is depicted as a fiery gitana, accompanied by a squabbling, superstitious retinue, her tío, Aunt Paca, and cousin Tumbita, and a noisy crowd of Spanish friends. Pastora immediately demonstrates her ignorance of Mexico, calling some mariachis gauchos. She later accompanies Pablo to see the real Mexico, which in this case means tourist trap Garibaldi Square and its mariachis. In a jab at Spain's technological underdevelopment, Pastora's backward uncle and cousin are frightened when they see a television. They believe a commercial for sleeping pills is a message from hell. Religious and civil relations are also touched upon in this film. Paca is angry at her husband and says, "They have divorce here and I feel like divorce." Press agent Chalillo falls in love with Paca, unaware she's married, and reinforcing the stereotype of greedy, tight-fisted Spaniards, cousin Tumbita extorts ever-increasing amounts of money from the Mexican to foment the romance. When Paca's husband finds out, instead of being jealously outraged, he demands half the proceeds. Despite the outrageous stereotyping of the Spanish characters, Gitana, Tenias, Casada still concludes with the inevitable Mexican-Spanish reconciliation at its conclusion, although only between Pastora and Pablo, since the rest of her family departs for Spain. This may be contrasted with a film such as Siempre Tuya, 1950, in which a poor Mexican farmer, Jorge Negrete, is elevated to radio stardom. He has an affair with an imported gringa actress played by Joan Page. He asks his wife for a divorce and is later shot by the gringa's lover. In El Bracero del Año, a Mexican migrant worker becomes a celebrity in the USA, and he has a romance, a publicity romance, with a gringa actress, but eventually returns to his Mexican sweetheart. Thus, the romantic reconciliation in Gitana, tenias, casada is not repeated in Mexican United States films, even those with very similar plots. Although there were a number of films on the topic in the 1960s, no particularly notable changes occurred in Mexico's relations with Spain. The on-screen images were modernized a bit, but they remained essentially static, and they decreased somewhat in frequency. Similarly, films about Mexican immigration to the United States were not especially numerous in the 1950s or 60s. Background Spaniards and gringos were still ubiquitous, though. Two 1970s movies, both co-productions, are particularly interesting. One made just a few months before the death of Francisco Franco, the other several years later as diplomatic relations were reestablished between Mexico and Spain for the first time since 1939. The Spanish play Anacletos y Divorcio was written in 1932 when the Second Republic passed a divorce law, subsequently repealed in 1939 by Franco. A film version was made in and set in Mexico in 1950. A remake was produced in 1975 as a Mexican-Spanish co-production entitled La Casada es mi mujer in Mexico and La Alegre Divorciado in Spain. The plot was revised to encompass binational characters and settings. Madrid shopkeeper Ramon and his wife Socorro visit Mexico for the transatlantic wedding of their son Carlos and Gloria, a Mexican. Socorro spends much of the trip fussing over her husband and forcing him to adhere to his diet. In Mexico City, Ramon meets the widowed Don Felipe and his accountant, Spanish emigre Gonzalitos. Gonzalitos is divorced, a concept which is new to Ramon. In Spain, he says, once you're married, you're stuck for life, with the priests meddling in your affairs. In Mexico, a clerk weds you and a clerk divorces you, no problem. He decides to jettison his overbearing wife at once. La Casada es mi mujer is hardly a serious look at such things, but the early scene in which Ramon contrasts the Spanish and Mexican marriage and divorce rules is instructive. In Mexico, only civil weddings have legal status, but many couples also have religious ceremonies. While Socorro says, of course she and Ramon were married in the church in Spain. Ramon's description of the rather cavalier way in which Mexican weddings and divorces are performed may seem a bit insulting to Mexico, but he contrasts this with a rather anti-clerical attitude about Spanish priests meddling in one's life. In the end, naturally, the conservative viewpoint prevails, and Ramon decides divorce isn't for him.